The Crooked Epic. Inn. The Inn of Maniacal Madness. Ted 1. The Mansion. 1B. 1. Theodore Good meandered through the cemetery late that afternoon in August 1961. He wore a long-sleeved flannel shirt, dark blue jeans, heavy black boots, and an old tan-colored Stetson. He had visited the grave sites of his mother and father, and 34 years after the tragedy, he wandered over toward the Murphy plot to see his childhood friend, Jacob. They had lost touch as Ted had grown older and married Sarah, but he wanted to pay respects to everyone in Ware whom he had lost. Ella, the mother, was the last matriarch in her genealogy. She was the trustworthy source of so much inspiration to Ted in his adulthood, and was the reason he became determined to stick together with Sarah once he had emancipated himself from his family's property. Ella Good never showed any affliction from the fear which stirred the world. Young Teddy had golden blonde hair and was thin. Alexander Graham Good, his brother, had darker hair, which matched his mother. Like many siblings, one's physical appearance more closely matched their father's, while their other matched the mother. The father was a U.S. Marshal, and their mother was a court stenographer until she died in 1923 of influenza. Ted Good was 10 years old in late 1927, the year of Hobb, Captain Gerard Hill, and the summer of the schism when Alex was 16. In late April, Alex was born in 1911, 6 years before the Great War draft of 1917 that took their 25-year-old father, Christopher, out to the war that raged in Europe. Ted remembered the father's cold study in the winter of 1926. In the wall behind his desk held the copy of the old poem, I Have a Rendezvous with Death. But before the summer of Hobb, when Ted was 5 years old still, he made an imaginary friend named Ahmed. Ahmed had been named after the first king of Afghanistan. His brother had been spending time borrowing books from the library, and one was a historical account of the Middle East. For some strange reason, Ted had become fixated on the story of Ali Baba and the level of Gilgamesh. The peculiarity spoke to his introversion and seclusion from the social constructs of his brother's peers. At one point, a teacher even yelled at Ted for referring to his homework help as Ahmed. Teddy ran home and asked his parents for guidance, which they showed him in encouraging his imagination. Eventually, after his mother died, Ahmed was replaced by other dreams, which all cut short during the tragedies of Hobb and Weir. On the dark ride home from the cemetery that evening, Theodore remembered his last day at home before leaving to work in Portsmouth and studying at the University of New Hampshire. There was not much particularly remarkable about that day. Still, he could recall vividly the faint light shining through the bedroom window that morning, the roast beef sandwich and potato dinner they had, and the afternoon walk with the border collie around the road to the lake. In the setting sun, he remembered aggressively skipping flattened shale stones across the rippling water while the dog sat in the shade of the trees. The dog began barking and would not stop until he left the stones alone. Alone, he began to weep that night, muffling sobs in his pillow as he lay down in his bedroom. Flipping over onto his back, he forced himself to stop, though, and made the vow never to let the memories of his youth become a torment ever again. To his credit, Ted's good accomplishment as a working man and family provider were enough to wipe the slate clean. This border collie was not the same dog they saw when they were together in Weir. It was bought a few years later, and he would leave it with his foster family when he went to college. After, he would not meet Sarah for almost half a decade when he had moved out, and nobody would bother with pet ownership until Mrs. Nowicki came to live with them with their Siamese cat, Katie. While the children were attending elementary, it was a welcome addition for them to have Katie in the house. When Mrs. Nowicki came to live with them, Justina, their daughter, was only 18 months old and Katie was 3. Sarah and he had originally met at the mansion, which was a hotel, restaurant, and saloon. He had been meeting Bernard, one of the Hills, a cousin of the captain and kin who worked labor on nearby farms. She had been helping a friend who was a housekeeper there with carpooling. After their introduction, Theodore had decided to stay on and get a day's work with Jeremy Hill, and they had met back up after the workday. He was happy to share the time with the crewmen of Uneducated Farmhand. Ted drove over to the old homestead and parked out front. He heard crickets chirping. It was now owned by a new family who had no idea about the summer of 1927. Theodore Adam Good's father's cottage in Wherry became a three-story Victorian-style house after Christopher's stepbrother, Ilarian's, renovations with a 60-acre backyard tract that was vast and wild with birch and white pine, balsam firs near the quarry site, and wood ferns throughout. There was also an old barn used as a garage for the two family-owned cars, one a gray 1918 Ford Model T town car, which had been used by their mother, and one a black 1924 Franklin Model T 10B, which his father used. He parked his car in the barn during the harsh winters, in front of hers, which sat there for almost half a decade after she had died. A tool shed, too, built by the father before they were born, was adjunct to the barn. A long driveway led into the barn that had once been a horse stable from an open front, dark metal gate that was lined with Solomon's seal all down the property line. For 400 feet, flaunting with its fragrance of hanging flowers which blossomed in the spring under the shade of the connected, rustic, twisting gate. The backyard had a well for groundwater which was filtered. There was also a pond when Father bought the land, but there were no fish anymore, just rushes and switchgrass. On the farther side of the backyard was the latrine. As the Goods did not have running water, they used an outhouse. They were less than a mile east of Horace Lake. As he drove away from the house, he did remember, though, the entire summer and years leading into Hob. Again, he vowed to drive it all the way out of his mind before he returned home to Sarah. Together, they inherited their land in rural Merrimack County for their family's home from Sarah's mother and father. Theodore and his wife were not agricultural farmers, though, despite their desires to harvest vegetable and floral gardens, arboretum, and orchards. Some of this land they sold, too, to impetuous granite prospectors who worked their lot for maybe only half a decade, late in the 1940s when he and his wife were still earning their way through master's degree at the University of New Hampshire. Sarah's father, Oscar, had passed, so her mother, Mrs. Nowicki, would become the stay-at-home nanny throughout the 50s and 60s. When Mrs. Nowicki died in the early 1970s, she left them with enough inheritance to purchase back the quarry that was already overgrown with wild vegetation. Later, in the years to come, on Christmas Eve of 1983, while Christian Good, his grandson, was still relatively young, he and Ted walked out late in the evening to the quarry. The moon cast her mournful light in a placid glow that swallowed over the edge of the granite walls as they approached. Sparkling moonlight along the walls of the quarry and the ice falling from the shimmering frozen creek bed, the flakes of snow covering the trees on the opposite end, and below them a bottomless chasm of blossoming lights which twinkled against their frosty breaths, crisply fogged in the chilling air of winter twilight. It reminded Theodore viscerally of his brother's various visions in the Discovery Hob. Christian wobbled out in front of him a few feet too far, too close to the ledge. Snapping into parental instinct, Ted stepped forward. He put his hand on Christian's shoulder, looking down at the back of his winter hat as the boy inquisitively raised his arm upward to the sky, exclaiming he had seen a shooting star and seeking acknowledgement. All Ted Good saw was light reflecting brightly across the quarry, igniting the scene for an instant of clarity until it was blindingly harsh, and he raised his left arm to cover his eyes. Then it was gone.